to SKToThePoint. Today we're going to touch upon a very important topic, and it's also one of the reasons why I wanted the format of this video to be different, both with regards to how I've shot this as well as the way I'm going to converse with you, because this topic is a very, very important topic, and it's also hot. It's burning. It's a burning topic right now, and I thought at SKToThePoint it was very important for me to take the time, delve into the topic, speak to people and stakeholders from different factions, different groups who are actively involved in solving this issue. So yes, and that's the reason this video will probably be one of the longest videos I've done. So the topic for today at SKToThePoint is the Manipur crisis. So the Manipur crisis, as we all know today, began on May 3rd, 2023. And while the violence has relatively reduced, and one could even say significantly reduced, the damage done to trust and the communal harmony out there is immense. The state of Manipur has witnessed a lull in physical attacks. No new villages have been targeted, and the looting of weapons, which kind of triggered the overall spate of violence and fights and clashes between the different groups involved, it has definitely stopped, especially from the armed race. However, the emotional and social wounds still do remain deep, and the psychological toll on the people of Manipur will definitely take years to heal. The things that I'll be speaking today are based on my detailed conversations with people of different groups, be it the Meiteis, be it the Kukis, and even the Nagas. And I also spoke to a few people that I cannot name them today, but a few people part of the Indian Army establishment and even the Assam Rifles group who are actively involved throughout the different spate of events that we've seen in the Northeast, and especially with what's happening in Manipur. So what do we know? During the peak of the violence, over 5,000 weapons and countless rounds of ammunition were looted from state armories in Manipur, highlighting a systematic breakdown in law and order back in 2023. And what we know as of now is that almost around 1,000 weapons have been recovered by the security forces out there, but the remaining firearms are still in circulation, posing a threat to the fragile peace in the state. I think it's essential to note that this unrest, while currently subdued, is far from resolved. The government, the security forces, and also the civil society are trying their best, and they must continue to collaborate to address every single underlying tensions and also try to work towards lasting peace in the region. Also, it's very important to document the fact that this, unlike what some part of the left media in India will tell you, and also most of the Western media would want you to believe, is that this is not a conflict between Hindus and Christians in the state of Manipur. This is not something that has anything to do with a fight between two religions. Definitely not. It's much more nuanced than that, and the religion is definitely not a factor in this conflict in Manipur now, or even whenever the conflicts have occurred prior to this spate of events. So I think that is one of the reasons why I wanted to take my time and do this video, because it could be very easily brushed aside as a fight between Hindus and Christians, where some homes are being burnt that belong to the Hindus, and then the churches are attacked that belong to the Christians. It's definitely not a religious violence. It's much more beyond that, and we will see what it is today. To understand the origins of this crisis, we need to go back to August 2015. Yes, the Manipur government back then passed 3 bills that has triggered the now long-standing fears among the hill tribes. So what were these 3 bills? So the first one was the land reforms, which were basically laws that were perceived as enabling the Meiteis, who already dominate the Imphal Valley, to gain control over the lands in the hills, which are constitutionally protected for Nagas and the Kukis. The second bill was all about the perceived exclusion from consultation. The passing of these bills reportedly occurred without adequate consultation with the Kukis and the Nagas, especially the legislators of the Kukis and the Nagas. So if you take a look at the number of seats in Manipur, out of this total seats that is around 60, 40 of the 60 seats in the legislature is held by the Meiteis. So because of this, the hill tribes felt greatly marginalized in the decision making. Another aspect of these bills was the reservation for Meiteis. This became a very big focal point again in May 2023, when the Manipur High Court ordered the state to consider granting scheduled tribe status to Meiteis within 15 days. I think that part of this having to be done within 15 days greatly escalated the situation. Naturally, this move sparked widespread fear among the Kukis and the Nagas, who believed that it would dilute their rights and at the same time allow Meiteis to buy land in the hills. Once again, repeating the fact that the hills are majorly occupied by the Kukis and the Nagas. So naturally, this brought in a lot of fear to both of these tribes. The immediate escalation on May 3rd, 2023 was obviously triggered by some peaceful marches organized by Kuki and Naga communities. These marches, which initially started as peaceful marches, soon turned violent, fueled by some fake viral videos and propaganda campaigns. So when there was a lot of fake videos and campaigns that started gaining traction in the social media, this led to simultaneous outbreaks of violence in Churachandpur and Imphal. And this set off a chain reaction, with homes being torched and armed groups clashing with each other. This event underscored how deeply rooted the distrust was between these communities. And this was escalated because of the spate of events and a lot of fear mongering and rumors being circulated in social media. And this is also a result of past that spans decades in terms of these communities being neglected and also having unresolved grievances among themselves. I think we all would be able to understand this because the Northeast for well over half a century have been neglected and their problems have not been discussed enough in the mainstream media or even in the mainstream politics. To understand this problem in its entirety, and like I keep saying, there are numerous nuances for us to understand with regards to the Manipur conflict, I think it's important to understand the history of Manipur. Manipur's history is steeped in diversity, but this has also been a major source of friction. The state's demographics include Meiteis, firstly, who are almost 53% of the entire Manipur population. So they are predominantly Hindu, and they reside in the fertile Imphal Valley, and they also dominate the political landscape. And then we have the Nagas, who are roughly around 18% in terms of population. They are primarily Christians, and they occupy the hill regions and have historical ties with the NSCN insurgent groups. We will talk more about them in the coming sections. And then we have the Kukis, who are around 14% of the total population. They are another hill tribe, and they have connections, strong connections, to Myanmar-based armed groups and insurgency groups as well. Then we have Bengali Muslims. They are a very small community, roughly around 7%, and they are often called as Bangals. And then the rest of the 2% of the population would include the Gorkhas and other very tiny minority communities. So before we look at the current spate of conflict between the Meiteis and the Kukis, I think when we are looking at the history, it's also important to understand the conflict between the Nagas and the Kukis themselves. Both are predominantly Christians, and this dates back to the early 1990s, so especially between 91 and 90. So state of Manipur saw bloody clashes over land and identity. This resulted in loss of thousands of lives. So this is not the first time that Manipur is seeing any kind of violent conflicts. And if you compare what has happened now to what happened in the early 90s, it's incomparable because you had thousands of people dying when there were conflicts between the Nagas and the Kukis. So why did this conflict happen in the early 90s? So the Nagas perceive Kukis as outsiders, as people who have encroached on their traditional territories. In contrast, the Kukis have historically relied on external support, particularly from Myanmar, whenever these kind of conflicts happen. And we are also seeing that currently, where the insurgent groups from Myanmar are definitely helping the Kukis with arms and other support. So for decades, if you see, interestingly, the Meiteis have stayed out of these conflicts. So they were going about doing their businesses in the valley region, but the hill region often saw Nagas and Kukis fighting with each other. But the changing dynamics, particularly post 2015, and then you also had these new bills being passed, these have brought the Meiteis into the fray as well when we talk about conflict in Manipur. This is a very interesting section and very important section rather, because to understand the Manipur crisis, we must definitely delve into the various armed and social groups operating not just in the northeast of India, but also in the bordering nations like Myanmar. So these groups are intricately linked through historical grievances, cross-border affiliations, and shared economic interests, particularly in illicit trades like arms and drugs. So this section, we will definitely try to unravel their roles, motivations, and the broader implications of their actions. So firstly, let's take a look at the groups that are affiliated with the Meiteis. Firstly, you have the UNLF, which is called the United National Liberation Front. It was formed in 1964, and it is one of the oldest insurgent groups in Manipur. The goal is to restore Manipur's sovereignty, which it claims it lost after the state's merger with India in 1949. The UNLF is not very active now, it's less active now, and the group has definitely has historical ties to armed groups, resistance groups across Southeast Asia. The next we look at People's Liberation Army of Manipur, not of China. So it's also called as the PLA, and this was established in 1980. And PLA of Manipur is an armed wing focused on separatist activities. They have historically received support from resistance groups in Myanmar, and even at times Chinese intelligence networks. They've also aided the PLA of Manipur in some way or the other. The PLA of Manipur remains influential in rallying sections of the Meitei population toward militant ideologies, though their activities have definitely waned. Their influence has also definitely waned in recent years. Aside from the groups that we've spoken about who often offer support to the Meiteis, I think the most important aspect of support for Meiteis is the political support. With 53% of the population, the Meiteis dominate Manipur politically, holding 40 out of the 60 seats in the Legislative Assembly. And this dominance definitely fuels resentment among the hill tribes, which are the Nagas and the Kukis, who basically perceive Meitei-led governance as a threat to their autonomy. Now let's take a look at groups that support the Kuki tribe. Firstly, we would start with the Kuki National Army, or the KNA. It is a major armed resistance group which represents Kuki interests, and it has strong affiliations with Myanmar-based Kuki Chin insurgents, part of the Chin state of Myanmar. Their ultimate goal is the creation of something that they call as the Zelangam, Greater Kuki state, which would span across parts of India, with obviously the parts of states of Manipur and Myanmar, and even parts of Bangladesh. So that is their ultimate goal in terms of the creation of the Zelangam state, right? So the KNA has basically leveraged porous borders of Manipur with Myanmar to secure arms and logistical support, and often they get these logistical support from groups from the Chin state of Myanmar. We also need to talk about the Myanmar-based Kuki Chin groups. So groups like the Chin National Army, or the CNA, or the Chin Defense Force, CDF, all originate from this Chin state, and they have very close ties with Kuki faction, the Kuki tribes in Manipur. These groups are heavily armed, and they engage in cross-border movements, exploiting the lack of strong enforcement that we have in the India-Myanmar border. Apart from them, there are also other support groups from Bangladesh even. So there are Bangladesh-based groups like the Kuki Chin National Front, KNF. They further extend the Kukis' regional connections. Trilateral support between Myanmar, Bangladesh, and India strengthen the Kuki cause, but this also complicates peace efforts that get played out. And from a community level support, the Kukis often feel marginalized by owing to the political domination of the Meitei groups. And their frustrations have definitely fueled the Kuki militant activities, and also over the years their demands for greater autonomy when it comes to Manipur. Now let's take a look at groups that are affiliated with the Nagas. Like I mentioned earlier in the video, we have the NSCN, which is basically the National Socialist Council of Nagaland. It's the oldest insurgent movement in the entire Northeast, with its origins in the early 1980s. It further split into two factions. You have the NSCN-IM, which is led by Tungilang Muiwa. This faction has a strong presence in Manipur. And then you have the NSCN-K, which is led by Kaplang. This faction operates out of Myanmar, and it often maintains cross-border smuggling routes, but it doesn't have a very strong presence in Manipur. When we talk about the goals of the NSCN, and both the factions basically aim for the creation of something that they call as the Naga Limb, or the Greater Nagaland, which would again involve parts from different states and countries. So here it would include parts of Manipur, obviously, and then you have parts of Assam, Arunachal Pradesh, and even Myanmar. The NSCN's emphasis on a unified Naga identity often brings them into conflict with Kuki groups, which also have overlapping interests in some of the territories that both want to have complete control on, especially in the hills. When we go back to the historical Naga-Kuki rivalry, especially between 1991 and 1996, the Nagas and Kukis have often engaged in violent clashes over land disputes primarily. Like I told you, the Nagas see the Kukis as outsiders, and who have historically migrated into their territories, especially from Myanmar. This rivalry definitely remains a key driver of instability in the region. In terms of the support system, the NSCN factions definitely leverage the proximity of Myanmar for arms training and the influx of refugees. There are definitely cross-border alliances with Myanmar-based Naga insurgents who have also helped strengthen their operational capabilities. Now, we have been seeing groups that primarily help Meiteis, Kukis, and the Nagas within India. Now let's take a look at groups which operate outside of India primarily. Let's start with Myanmar first. So in Myanmar, we have something called as the UWSA, which is the United Vast State Army, and it's a very, very important armed group. UWSA basically operates in Myanmar's vast state, which is actually an autonomous region bordering Myanmar and China. It is one of the most powerful non-state armed groups that we have in Southeast Asia, with close to 25,000 fighters in their ranks. And they also have sophisticated weaponry, including artillery and in some occasions even tanks. So that's how powerful and dangerous the UWSA is. The UWSA basically serves as a key supplier of arms to militant groups in Manipur, and they often have been known to support both the Kukis and the Nagas in this process. While their primary focus is on their own conflict with the Myanmar junta and the government, the UWSA's networks also extend to India's northeast. And finally, there is definitely a lot of Chinese influence as well, whether directly or indirectly, right? So China often uses the UWSA as a proxy to maintain leverage in Myanmar and try their hand at destabilizing India's northeast. The UWSA operates largely with a lot of financial and logistical backing from the Chinese government and agencies. So aside from the vast state in Myanmar, we should definitely also understand the Chin state in Myanmar. So that's where we have the Chin National Army, which is based in Myanmar's Chin state, and it is closely aligned with Kuki groups in Manipur. They share the goal of establishing a unified Kuki-Chin identity across India, Myanmar, and probably even parts of Bangladesh. And then you have something called as the Chin Defense Force, which is the CDF. It's another prominent militia operating in Myanmar, and they engaged in armed resistance against the Myanmar junta, but they also support the Kuki movements in India, in India's northeast. I think it's very important to understand that the Chin armed groups serve as logistical and operational allies for the Indian Kuki groups, supplying weapons, intelligence, and even manpower at times. And we've seen few evidences of this in the current conflict between the Kukis and the Meiteis in Manipur. There are involvements from other armed groups as well. For example, like the Arakan Army, which primarily operates in Myanmar's Rakhine state, and the Arakan Army, or the AA, has indirect connections to Manipur through shared smuggling routes of arms and drugs often. And the AA basically focuses on its conflict with the Myanmar government or the junta, but it also occasionally collaborates with other regional groups in the region. And then we have the Kachin Independence Army, or the KIA. So they are based in the Kachin state of Myanmar, and this group is more aligned with Myanmar's internal dynamics, but it also contributes to the broader instability in the region, particularly through arms and drugs trade. So how do all these groups combine in this cohesive instability that the Northeast often sees, especially with regards to armed rebellion, right? So you're talking about the cross-border dynamics and basically the smuggling routes of both arms and drugs in this region. So these groups are basically connected by a shared reliance on illicit trade to fund their operations naturally. So the smuggling routes are basically across the India-Myanmar border, and this serves as a lifeline for arms. It includes sophisticated weaponry flows from Myanmar to Manipur, often originating from Chinese suppliers or pilfered from Myanmar's junta. And then you're talking about drugs. Myanmar's Shan state, it's a hub of poppy cultivation, and they supply heroin and synthetic drugs even, like meth. Popularly they call it as the yaba tablets, and they are smuggled to Indian markets. This interconnection of these groups creates a self-sustaining cycle of violence supply chain that is very, very difficult to break. It has multiple players vying for dominance, and naturally the region remains in a constant state of flux. While we are discussing this, I think it's very important to mention that just a few days back, the Indian Coast Guard made a historic seizure of close to 5 tons of drugs that were intercepted from a boat off the Andaman coast. And this is a record-breaking operation in terms of the quantity of the seizure, and it is said to be the largest in the history of the Indian Coastal Guard, which spans across 50 years. The key thing to note here is that the boat that was smuggling this, the 5 tons of drugs has its origin from Myanmar. So it was a Myanmarese boat. And this is a significant piece of detail in the context of what we are discussing. So the Manipur crisis is not a single layered conflict. Now you would have understood a bit of the context from the different stakeholders involved and the different groups that play out and the history of the state itself. So it's definitely not a single layered conflict, but it's a culmination of historical grievances, political marginalization, economic disparities, the militarization of the civilian populations. I think that's very important as well. So let's unpack the current issues driving this particular unrest in a detailed manner. So when we talk about the core of the conflict, and at the heart of the Manipur crisis is the fear of losing land. So that's the main point here. So the Meitei community, concentrated in the Imphal Valley regions, has long been restricted from purchasing land in the hill areas. So in the hill areas, you typically have the Kukis and the Nagas. These hill areas have been predominantly reserved for the Naga and the Kuki tribes under constitutional safeguards. So the May 2023 High Court directive asking the state government to consider granting the scheduled tribe status to the Meiteis within 15 days, that's the key part. So that basically triggered widespread anxiety among the hill tribes. So they feared that this would dilute their constitutional protections offered by the constitution, and it kind of would open their lands to be acquisitioned by the politically dominant Meiteis in the state of Manipur. I think that's the critical fear factor that these tribes had. Like I pointed out earlier, historically itself, the land has always been a key factor in any of the contentious issues that Manipur has seen. So the 2015 bills passed by the Manipur Legislative Assembly, it basically sought to redefine the land ownership laws and were perceived by the hill tribes as an attempt to by the Meiteis to encroach upon their territories. The lack of consultation with Kukis and the Naga legislators further alienated these communities. There was no consensus in this kind of passing of the bill. I think that was one of the key reasons for this distrust and the fear of both these communities in the hilly regions. And like I also mentioned earlier, the imbalance in representation is belonging to the Meitei groups, and the rest of the 20 MLAs were from both the Kukis and the Naga tribes. I think this definitely deepened the mistrust among the three communities. The other point that was a very key thing in this unrest is the weaponization of civilians. So during the May 2023 violence, over 5,000 weapons and countless rounds of ammunition were looted from state armories. So this was unprecedented in scale and definitely pointed to a systematic failure in the security protocols back then. So what really happened during this looting of weapons is that the Meiteis, who felt underarmed compared to the Kukis, because the Kukis naturally had a lot more in terms of logistical support, the other armed groups within India as well as across the border. So the Meiteis basically felt underarmed compared to the Kukis, and this was primarily responsible for them looting the state armory and looting around 5,000 weapons. And there are some criticisms as to how this was allowed to happen, but that's a topic for another day. So what happened after that? The Kukis, on the other hand, had already been accumulating arms for years, like I mentioned, through the external support, particularly from Myanmar-based groups. So in terms of the response to this, so despite warnings of escalating tensions, the state security apparatus looked unprepared to handle the scale of the violence. So that is something that has been documented. And the armories which were housing these weapons, they were poorly guarded, and the looters faced minimal resistance, is what we hear from many of the security experts on the northeast, and also some sources from the security apparatus that is currently overlooking the security in Manipur, who are not part of the state security establishment. What we hear is that the security forces who were guarding the armories, they were avoiding the use of force to basically prevent civilian casualties. So the looters were allowed to loot, and then they were not stopped by any kind of armed resistance by the security group that was securing the armories. Left a dangerous legacy, if you'd like to understand. Even though, like I said before, 1,000 weapons have already been recovered, actually 4,000 still remain in circulation. And this has not just armed the militants, but has also armed the civilians, which should further prolong the conflict. I think another aspect that added fuel to fire is definitely the misinformation, spreading of dated videos, rumors, fear mongering among social media. So this is the point of weaponized information warfare, right? So what we understand from many of the people that I spoke to from the Indian Army as well as the Assam Rifles is that there was a lot of fake news and bias reporting. And this is also something that I did hear from a journalist friend of mine. It's a very interesting story. I'll not like to sidestep too much, but when I was looking to get a story from him. He was working in a southern part of India and he was a journalist and he belongs to the Meitei tribe. But he had certain things to say about the violence between Meiteis and Kukis, and he was hounded by people of both the tribes, and he was actually in a hiding city in another city in southern part of India. And he told me very clearly about how Manipur has two different sets of media groups. One set is pro Meitei and one set is pro Kuki, and it predominantly boils down to where they're located. If they're from the valley, they're naturally inclined towards Meiteis, and if they're from the hills, they're carrying a different tone of reporting, which would obviously suit the Kukis or the Nagas, right? So propaganda from both sides did fuel retaliatory attacks, while platforms like WhatsApp and Facebook became conduits for divisive narratives. I think the stark example is the viral video that we saw of two Kuki women. They were naked and they were paraded by people, and this was actually a video that spread like wildfire for obvious reasons. It was a terrible thing to see. It was a terrible thing to have happened for the two women who were paraded, and it was a terrible thing to watch. But what's important here is that so this video was actually released 2 months after the actual incident, and while one cannot dispute the fact that it was important that the truth had to be told, but the important thing here is the timing of the video release was what was important. So a security expert that I spoke to, he said that this was just before a major round of peace talks were being scheduled, and people from key stakeholders from all the tribes were going to be part of it. The Indian Army and the Assam Rifles were going to be a part of it. The state government and the civil society, members from the civil society, all of them were going to be part of it. It was a very important peace talk that was going to happen. So this video was released just prior to that, and that is why we can definitely not discount information warfare, whether it is coming from across the border, whether it is happening from within. I think these things really contributed to a further spike in escalation of the violence that we saw in Manipur. In terms of accountability, I think neither side has taken responsibility for the propaganda war, which continues to deepen the mistrust between communities till today. There is also this lack of trust in institutions. So you're talking about the perceived state bias that I've often mentioned does exist. The Kukis and the Nagas view the Meitei-dominated government as inherently biased, and the handling of the crisis, particularly the armory lootings and the delayed interventions, has definitely reinforced this perception. The law enforcement agencies, including the state police, have often been accused of favoring the Meiteis, further alienating the communities in the hillside. And another interesting thing is the High Court order itself, which wanted to expedite the ST status of the Meiteis, and it was seen by the hill communities as dismissal of their concerns. And this has also strained the relationship between the judiciary and these communities. In terms of the polarization, the crisis has definitely starkly divided Manipur along ethnic lines, with Meitei-dominated valleys and Kuki Naga hill regions becoming almost inaccessible to each other. So the stories of atrocities on both sides, such as burning of homes and religious sites like churches, have definitely created a cycle of vengeance that continues to fuel a lot of animosity between the groups. This has also led to a major economic fallout. So you're talking about the violence that we've seen over the last 1 year, and this has definitely disrupted Manipur's economy, particularly its agricultural activities and trade activities. The hill regions, which are vital for cash crops, have seen massive displacement of communities because of this violence that we've seen, and this violence has also affected the border trade with Myanmar, which is definitely a key economic activity, and it has been severely impacted, adding to the economic woes of Manipur. In terms of the economy, we also need to talk about the radicalization of youth of Manipur. The lack of economic opportunities has driven many young people towards militancy or illegal activities, so like arms smuggling or drug smuggling, drug trafficking, and this is definitely going to further destabilize the region if it's not nipped in the bud. I think it's very important to talk about Assam Rifles, or the AR, which is India's oldest paramilitary force, and they've been at the forefront of managing the Manipur crisis, and not just the Manipur crisis, anything that's related to the Northeast. Their role is often misunderstood, and it's very critical to understand how India maintains stability in Northeast, which is basically a region rife with ethnic tensions and insurgency. So Assam Rifles is just like paramilitary force similar to the Rashtriya Rifles, the RR that we know, which is much more popular. And it's very important to understand the role of Assam Rifles in this overall context. So when we talk about Assam Rifles, it's important to understand their legacy and experience. And Assam Rifles was established in 1835. Yes, 1835. So you know how old they are, and it's close to 200 years now. So they're 190 years old, and they have unparalleled knowledge of the Northeast, making it uniquely qualified to handle conflicts across Northeast. The Assam Rifles have deep cultural assimilation into the various regions of the Northeast, and this allows them to navigate complex ethnic dynamics. For instance, 28% of the Assam Rifles personnel hail from the Northeast itself, and out of this, the Meiteis are 60%. The Kukis are around 25 to 30% is what we understand among the Manipur recruits. Assam Rifles has historically been instrumental in counterinsurgency operations and border management, particularly along the Indo-Myanmar border. And why is it important to understand about Assam Rifles is, it's very important to understand the role that they have played in containing the violence in the Manipur conflict. So let's start with the first day of the violence, 3rd 2023. So if you talk about the early intervention of Assam Rifles, they were among the first to recognize the scale of violence that were going to take place on May 3rd, 2023, and that their perception of threat ensured that the Indian Army was deployed within 48 hours on the Manipur land from May 3rd, 2023, which was the day when the violence took off and you had the looting, etc., of the armory. They provided safe passages to civilians fleeing the violence. They rescued Meiteis who had crossed into Myanmar, and they also helped Kukis to escape volatile areas that were affected by violence. So they've been as neutral as possible. They are after all the Indian paramilitary force. They are part of Assam Rifles. They are not going to be biased towards Meiteis, Kukis, or Nagas. So that's a very, very important thing to understand here. In terms of the humanitarian assistance, Assam Rifles, they play a big role across Northeast, and not just about stopping insurgency or handling conflicts like this, but even during the Manipur floods earlier in 2023, it was the Assam Rifles that saved thousands of lives, underscoring their commitment to the people of the Northeast. So what we understand from the handling of the riots is that the Assam Rifles has certainly engaged a lot with the local communities to foster dialogue and reduce the tensions among the various groups in Manipur. And like I said, their deep local knowledge often surpasses that of the state police or any other Indian Army paramilitary group, and this is very important for them, given that they understand the local nuances, so they are better off in trying to ease the situation among different communities. And this has also kind of hindered Assam Rifles at times, because there has been cases where their local knowledge surpasses that of the Manipur state police, and because of that there are some frictions that we have seen between Assam Rifles and the state police in the past. But like any other paramilitary group that is part of the Indian Armed Forces, the Assam Rifles has also faced allegations of favoring certain communities, particularly the Kukis. This perception is from the fact that 25 to 30% of their Manipuri contingent is basically Kuki representation. But there is of course a counterbalance of the rest of the 60% of the Manipuri contingent being Meiteis. So such accusations are largely unfounded. But you do have a fair share of these allegations against any armed force group across the globe. Why restrict only to India? So let's talk about the operational challenges that Assam Rifles often face, and especially during this latest conflict in Manipur. So the Assam Rifles battalions, currently they have been stationed in Manipur for well over a year, ever since the violence peaked, and it originated in May 2023, and this has basically led to a lot of logistical constraints for the Assam Rifles, and definitely fatigue as well, stationed in the same place for well over a year. And the volatile nature of the conflict requires constant vigilance, and this has basically stretched the resources of the Assam Rifles in Manipur. In terms of the borders that Manipur has, and in terms of the northeast borders with neighboring countries, securing the Indo-Myanmar border with its rugged terrain and free movement regime that in the Indian government and the Myanmarese government have in place is definitely a monumental task. Despite their best efforts, the Assam Rifles faces limitations in curbing the flow of arms and drugs, because it's such a porous region. Relatively speaking, India-Pakistan border is much more easier to police and barricade and fence, but the border in the northeast with Myanmar is way more porous, and not the entire stretch is not fenced, and you also have this free movement trade that is facilitated by both the countries. Let's take a look at some of the highlights of the Assam Rifles, starting with their unmatched expertise of the northeast region. Like I mentioned, they have the knowledge of the local dynamics. Unlike other security forces, the Assam Rifles has a nuanced understanding of the different ethnic, cultural, and historical complications in the Northeast. They are not just limited to that. So when you talk about the national security aspect, beyond Manipur, Assam Rifles also play a crucial role in guarding India's northern borders, and it's very, very important to highlight their role in the 1962 Sino-Indian War. The Assam Rifles was instrumental in securing key positions ahead even of the Indian Army. I think that's something that they're very, very massively proud of in terms of their achievements. Assam Rifles have also undergone a lot of modernization in recent times, and a very key aspect is that the inclusion of women soldiers in the AR battalions, and this has marked a very progressive step. With women personnel now also participate in operations like patrolling, ambushes, raids. It basically enhances the capabilities of the Assam Rifles, and it also brings in a lot of trust with the local communities when there are women involved in the patrolling of their villages or streets, etc. So that's a very commendable effort by the Assam Rifles leadership. To understand the crisis in Manipur, it's very important to understand the role of Myanmar. It cannot be overlooked. Porous 1,643-kilometer border between India and Myanmar has always been a double-edged sword, especially for India. While the agreements between the two nations allows cultural and familial ties to flourish, it also facilitates the unchecked flow of weapons, drugs, and even insurgent groups. So we all know that the situation within Myanmar has been very volatile since their democratically elected government was overthrown by the military junta, and this happened in Feb 2021. And basically, the political turmoil has escalated the region's pre-existing challenges, including insurgency, poppy cultivation, and definitely arms trafficking as well. So let's talk about the challenges that India faces primarily. We have to touch upon the FMR, or the free movement regime. So under the free movement regime, which both countries have agreed upon, communities within 16 kilometers of either borders can cross freely without any kind of visas. So if you are in either side of the borders within the 16-kilometer range, you can move to Myanmar if you're on the Indian side, or if you're on the Myanmarese side, you can definitely move to the Indian villages. And this is what the FMR facilitates. This system, though intended to preserve the cultural ties that these villages have on either side of the borders, has definitely been exploited for illegal activities. So you talked about arms trafficking, drug smuggling. So you're talking about sophisticated weaponry moving in from Myanmar, which could often be weapons that have originated from China, and they are coming into India. You're talking about automatic rifles, explosives, etc., which flows into Manipur. And then you have drugs, narcotics procured in the Shin state of Myanmar, and this is also part of the Golden Triangle, in terms of narcotics and drug trafficking, and they enter India through this border between India and Myanmar. And despite best efforts from the Indian side to monitor the border, the fencing remains incomplete. It's not completely fenced along the entire stretch of the border between India and Myanmar. And smugglers definitely have the chance to exploit the rugged terrain to move contraband. Plans to suspend the free movement regime is something that's definitely being discussed from the Indian side. And they're also planning to establish around 42 to 45 regulated entry and exit points between India and Myanmar, and this will also have smart fencing. These discussions are definitely in progress, but it will take a few more years for these things to be implemented fully. The other aspect is that we've discussed about the cross-border militancy, especially originating from Myanmar. We talked about the KCNA, or the Kuki National Army, the UWSA, the United Wa State Army, which I told you they also have tanks and around 25,000 armed soldiers. And then you also have the Kuki groups, which are based, most of them are based in Myanmar, some are based in Bangladesh. They also complicate the region's insurgency dynamics with great efforts. And like we've discussed before, these groups often receive covert support from China, which basically use them as proxies to maintain influence over Myanmar and also states within India. When we talk about drug trafficking, I think it's very important to understand Myanmar is a cornerstone of the Golden Triangle. So it is one of the largest drug producing regions. The recent geopolitical shifts, such as the Taliban themselves banning poppy cultivation in Afghanistan after they've come back to take over Afghanistan, has resulted in an opposite effect in terms of the poppy production or the drug production in Myanmar. So the poppy cultivation, especially in the Shan state of Myanmar, the area across which the poppy gets cultivated has expanded to over 47,000 hectares. Is what we have come to know, and this is a significant increase, making Myanmar basically the epicenter of global opium production. Now that Taliban has at least officially clamped down on poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, and it is not just about the organic drug trade, but you're also talking about the chemical drug trade. You're talking about the synthetic drugs. There are dedicated factories across Shan and Chin state within Myanmar, which large scale produce methamphetamine, which is popularly called as the meth, and they also make these yaba tablets, which are smuggled into India, and they are spread. They are there's this supply chain that takes them across Southeast Asia. You're talking about even Sri Lanka and eventually the Maldives as well. So this is how the entire Golden Triangle supply chain works. In terms of the supply chain, you talk about the drugs originate in Myanmar, then they enter Manipur, Mizoram, Nagaland, and they definitely fuel addiction and kind of create a parallel economy that destabilizes the region in a great manner. So the security forces have seized contraband worth 6,000 crores in just the last 5 years, but this is definitely the tip of the iceberg, like what we've seen in just a few days back across the Andaman coast. In terms of the cultural and societal ties between India and Myanmar, I think the key thing to note is the Treaty of Yandabo, which was signed in 1826. This marked the formalization of borders between India and Myanmar. However, for the communities living along these borders, these lines remain largely artificial in terms of borders. There are century old familial, cultural, and social bonds that exist between the villages on both sides of the border, making enforcement of natural boundaries a very, very sensitive issue for the local communities. So I don't know how the scrapping of FMR will really work with regards to these communities. But from a national security, I think it's very, very important. But it's a very political issue as well that the government will have to decide on. Let me give you an example to make this more understandable. So many Kukis in Manipur have ancestral ties to Myanmar's Chin state, and that's naturally why you have these insurgent groups in the Chin state, which offer tacit support to the Kuki rebels. The mutual respect shown by border communities during crises, such as providing shelter to fleeing citizens, definitely underscores the depth of these ties. So, for example, in May 2023, there were a lot of Meitei refugees who were sheltered by locals in Myanmar before being escorted back into the Indian villages by the Assam Rifles. So Manipur and Kashmir are often compared in terms of conflict zone, but they differ in ways. Kashmir, for instance, faces Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, primarily driven by religious tensions, whereas Manipur grapples with ethnic diversity, porous borders with Myanmar and other countries, and definitely a lot of external influences, particularly from Myanmar and China. So Manipur's issues are compounded also by the Golden Triangle. That's something that we just spoke about in terms of smuggling of narcotics and arms, with Myanmar becoming a central hub. So it's not a very like-to-like comparison, that we can have between Kashmir and Manipur. They are totally different. And in Kashmir, the religion is a very big part, but in Manipur, it's more of the historical aspects of the local communities and their affiliations with other bordering villages and countries in general. So it's not a like-to-like comparison. So the arms and drug nexus that we've been talking about basically originates from Myanmar, and it is very, very central to the instability in Manipur and the overall northeastern region. In terms of the arms trafficking, the arms get trafficked into India, and they often originate from the vast state in Myanmar. The UWSA, which we've spoken about earlier, has its own extensive weaponry and also logistical and financial support from China. It's a major supplier of arms into Indian states. Myanmar's own internal conflicts have also created a surplus of weapons that find their way into the northeast through well-established smuggling routes. The local militant groups like the Kuki National Army also rely heavily on these channels to arm themselves. In terms of the drug trafficking, we've already spoken about the Shan state, and we've also seen why Myanmar has become a central hub now, owing to the reduction of poppy cultivation in Afghanistan, and the Golden Triangle definitely plays a very key role in the drug trafficking market that is currently thriving across the borders. A very important thing to understand is that the economic returns from narcotics are staggering, and the illicit trade has led to a sharp rise in poppy cultivation, even in the hill regions of Manipur. Often, what gets done is that to evade detection from the security forces, the poppy fields are often surrounded by paddy crops, which is the cash crop of the hill regions, and this basically makes the security forces makes it harder for the security forces to or the authorities to locate the poppy fields which are surrounded by the paddy crops. So what is the solution to resolve the Manipur issue? So let's take step by step. The first would obviously be to strengthen the border security, complete the smart fencing, relook at the FMR. I think these are very important aspects that the government has to look at. Definitely the surveillance has to be improved and increased along the border areas, and Now the security forces have definitely started using a lot of drones to monitor remote areas of the border for any kind of infiltration or smuggling of arms or drugs. So I think strengthening border security is very important. The next is, of course, having a more deeper diplomatic engagement with Myanmar. India has traditionally had decent ties with the Myanmar Janta or the army, and they definitely need to work to curb cross-border smuggling. I think it would be definitely a win-win for both the Indian government as well as the Myanmar Janta. And they also have to understand and try and encourage trilateral cooperation between India, Myanmar, and Bangladesh to disrupt the drug and arms trafficking network. It's very, very easier said than done, especially with the fact that with Bangladesh, you're handling a hostile government as of now. It's an interim government led by Mohammad Yunus. On the other hand, in Myanmar, you're talking about a stateless country in terms of the junta holding sway over the people, and there's not one person that you can trust, because the army is also going to be leveraging upon these rebel groups, and there's a lot of corruption there to talk about as well. So it's a very, very tricky situation for India in terms of engaging with both Bangladesh and Myanmar with this regard. The next thing is, of course, what India is doing already and what India can do more is to develop the Northeast in terms of the economic aspect. So provide alternative livelihoods for the border communities who are more so now dependent on smuggling activities. So help them to come to mainstream economy, get them educated, get them jobs. For example, you can the government is definitely looking at promoting cash crops that can replace poppy cultivation. So there are certain things that the government is already doing with the civilian society. So I think that would definitely improve the fortunes of the Northeast going forward. One thing that the Indian government has not done a lot is probably applying international pressure on China, especially with regards to their support for groups like the UWSA, which do a lot of cross-border smuggling and trying to destabilize the northeastern states. I think India's presence in Myanmar, strengthening India's presence in Myanmar through development projects and diplomatic activities is also something that the Indian government is involved in to counter the Chinese influence. I think that's also something that is a very important aspect, because the Myanmar Janta is also aware that the Chinese government tacitly supports groups like the UWSA, which fight the Janta in return. Now let's talk about a topic that we briefly touched upon in the earlier part of the videos. It's the biased media narratives and information warfare that we saw as part of the Manipur crisis. I think that's very important to focus on. The Manipur crisis has significantly seen a lot of biased media narratives and information warfare, and that has resulted in catastrophic escalations of violence. And this has basically also deepened the mistrust between the communities. And these narratives, often rooted in partial truths or outright falsehoods, have basically leveraged the social media platforms to spread rapidly, manipulating public opinion and even sabotaging peace efforts, like we saw with regards to the videos of the two Kuki women who were paraded. Like I spoke earlier, there are two different sides of the media narratives in Manipur. One is the valley media, which is Meitei dominant, and then you have the hill media, which is Kuki dominant, right? So the media in the Imphal Valley, which is basically dominated by the Meiteis, has often framed the Kukis as external aggressors or beneficiaries of illegal activities, particularly in terms of drugs and arms trafficking. These outlets often emphasize the looting of weapons by Kuki and external support from Myanmar, portraying the Meiteis as victims defending their land. So basically, they are justifying the looting of weapons from the state armory by the Meiteis in order to defend themselves against the heavily armed Kuki tribes. Issues like poppy cultivation and alleged illegal immigration by Kukis are also magnified to justify the actions of the Meitei communities in the recent violent events that we've seen across Manipur. In terms of the Kuki-dominated hill media, so you're talking about that part of the media highlighting the victimization of the Kuki tribe, framing the Meiteis as aggressors, and also having this disproportionate state power in terms of the number of MLAs and the legislators. There are also stories about the alleged targeting of Kuki villages, destruction of churches, and looting of armories, which are obviously amplified to portray that the Meiteis are the aggressors, backed by the state and central government agencies. So this has basically led to Manipur not having a neutral narrative. Both the media factions rarely provide balanced reporting. This is something that I've heard from people who are living in Manipur and also are journalists. So they also agree of the camera that it's no real neutral narrative that is coming out of media houses within Manipur. Either you talk about the valley based media agencies or the hill based media agencies, they focus on their respective communities' grievances while neglecting the other's perspective. So this has created two completely separate versions of the same conflict from the same state, further polarizing communities. In terms of the national media, I think especially the mainstream television channels and online platforms, they often fail to provide nuanced coverage of Northeast India, and reports are typically delayed or incomplete at times, where many outlets only began covering the Manipur crisis weeks after the violence had erupted. So that is one. Often, even when they're reported, there's a lot of sensationalism there. They focus on specific incidents such as the viral videos that we talked about, or isolated acts of violence, but they do not look at the systemic issues that are the underlying barriers of this conflict. I think that's something that has been totally lost in translation. And of course, you predominantly have these distractions. So you have the overshadowing of other events. So issues like Manipur crisis are often sidelined in favor of news from more politically or economically prominent regions like Delhi or Mumbai or any other part of India that overshadows the events that are taking place in Manipur. I think the spate of events in Manipur also threw a lot of light on the spread of fake news and propaganda and the misuse of social media. Like I touched upon, when on May 3rd, 2023, shortly after Kuki and Naga marches turned violent, fake videos began to circulate widely on social media, and these videos started showing atrocities by one group against another, and they were later found to be unrelated to the Manipur crisis. So, but by the time the damage was already done, there were retaliatory attacks on homes, religious sites, and individuals, and a cycle of violence fueled by outrage rather than verified facts started to take shape. And the case study is that, again, going back to the woman being paraded naked, is that, like I mentioned before, the horrifying video was viral in July 2023, and this was weeks after the violence had supposedly de-escalated in the region. And this video was released just 2 days prior to leaders of Kuki and the Meitei communities who were scheduled to meet for peace talks. So like I told you, the timing was very, very suspicious, because the timing suggests that there was a deliberate sabotage by vested interest aiming to prolong the conflict in the region. The video's release basically reignited tensions and stalled dialogue, showcasing the devastating impact of weaponized information. So both the sides, both Meiteis and Kukis, had their own share of things to put on social media, and most of them were woefully inaccurate or false truths, or half truths. And the social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp basically acted as echo chambers where users predominantly consumed information aligned with their community's perspective, and the algorithms promoting engagement further amplified the divisive content that was being shared so widely. And another very worrying aspect that happened was, the Northeast limited access to robust fact-checking mechanisms, and this basically allowed a lot of fake news to spread unchecked. This was complicated by poor digital literacy in many of the areas, and that compounded the effect as well. It is also important to understand that groups like the NSCN and the Kuki National Army were also actively involved in rallying support and justifying their actions on social media. So there were a lot of videos that showed attacks on the communities, and these were circulated to recruit members and solicit international sympathy. This is the typical way of how the jihadism and the radical elements involved, work to recruit people. They often show videos of, where some Muslim members are killed in any part of the world, and then they rally support, get funding, and also recruit members into their group. So this was similarly done by the NSCN or the KNA as well during the Manipur conflict. And it's also something that we cannot be without talking about, is that the Chinese intelligence networks also played a significant role, engaging in disinformation campaigns to destabilize India's northeast. So this is consistent with China's broader strategy of exploiting the ethnic fault lines in the border regions, which would probably benefit them in the long run. I think with all the topics that we've covered today, I think it would have given you a very good perspective of where this conflict lies and what is the background of this conflict, what is the historical perspective, and the nuanced understanding that one needs to basically understand what is wrong, what has gone wrong in Manipur, and what are the possible solutions that the Indian government would have. The first thing would definitely be to assuage all the communities and the stakeholders involved, get the civil society in line to basically convince the people to remove the fear and the hatredness that they share for each other. You're talking about the communities in the valleys, you're talking about the communities in the hills. I think it's very, very important for them to remove the fear and start trusting the process with regards to the state government and the central government and also the judiciary in question. I think it's also important that the state government has more accountability going forward. The chief minister of Manipur has been severely criticized for his role and for his lack of action that probably led to the escalation of violence. And he even offered to resign, but he is still not resigned his post as the chief minister. And there's a lot of accusations on his political acumen and also the central government for aiding the chief minister to be in power and not taking any corrective measures with regards to his candidature. But aside from that, I think accepting that certain things have gone wrong and looking at the way forward is the best way to solve this crisis in Manipur. The biased media narratives and information warfare have definitely added fuel to the volatile situation. So definitely to counter this, I think it's very, very important that the state sees promotion of neutral platforms in terms of media to establish neutral media outlets that can report fairly on both the hills as well as the valley groups, avoiding any kind of community centric biases amongst the local media. Another aspect that we need to focus on is the digital literacy of the people out there. I think identifying what is fake and what is not is a universal problem across different states in India, but more so in Manipur. I think the lack of digital literacy has really played a part in the spreading of rumors and fake messages, etc., which kind of exploit the gullible and lead to more violence in the state. I think that's something that the government has to take stock of. And in terms of regulation, I think the government should also work with tech companies to curb the spread of inflammatory content while ensuring freedom of speech. And yes, there has been a lot of clampdown on the internet networks in Manipur to curb such spread of rumors. But I think the government also needs to be actively involved with the tech majors like the Facebook and WhatsApp to quickly identify and monitor what's fake and what is not and what is spreading. And that will also help them to take corrective measures in appropriate regions in terms of what's going wrong and what's being spread in terms of WhatsApp forwards, etc. And to finally talk about the community engagement, I think the local leaders, influencers, and different organizations, they need to come out and speak against misinformation and promote peace. I think Manipur is too critical a state like any of the northeastern states for India, and it's all part of the mainland India. So I don't think we need to differentiate between northeast and the rest of the India. I think all of them are states that are part of the union of states belonging to one country called India. I think this is very, very important for us as a nation to stick together and ensure that Manipur comes back to normalcy, the people of Manipur come back to normalcy, and Manipuri people living outside of the state are also happy, and they feel safe going back to their states. I think that's very, very important, and that can only happen when the normalcy returns in the state. So this is basically what is the overall picture of what's happening in Manipur. I hope you have all got a better perspective. And that's the only reason why I wanted to do this long video, because it's very, very important for us to understand every single aspect that is connected with the state in terms of its history, cultural identity, the differences, and what led to this specific unrest starting in 2023. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation that we've had. I don't think it's a video, it's more of a conversation that I was having with you. Please do share in your comments on this video any questions that you have, any discussions that you would like me to touch upon going forward on this topic or anything else. And until next time, I will see you soon with something else that is thought-provoking as well as interesting to all of you. See you again at SK to the Point. Cheers.